Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the inaugural edition of Laporte Cafe. Our goal with the series today is to provide you with a trending topic that we've identified here at Laporte that affects the public sector in order to provoke some conversations, both internal and external, and it'll lead to some improvements in the strengthening of your organization. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are muted, videos are off, and the chat function has been disabled. For our presentation, it's just going to be conversational only, so there are no prepared slides. And finally, all questions can be submitted via the Q&A portal. It's at the very bottom of the screen. If you pop up the little bar at the bottom with the tools, it should say Q&A, so you can submit questions through that. And we'll try to address those at the end. This morning, my name is Lester Rishu. I'm a director here in Audit and Assurance Services at Laporte, and with me today is Anthony Rutledge, a senior manager in Audit and Assurance Services. And today's topic is implementing controls in a digital and remote working environment. So Anthony, what does all that mean? How is the digital and remote working environment affected with the COVID pandemic?
Thanks, Lester. No, it's definitely been a unique year of trying to unpack a lot of the changes that we've had to deal with respect to the pandemic. But the core with respect to digital change and actual control change in the digital environment really comes with unintended consequences, right? What's happened in your current environment? What's changed in your current environment that you may not even realize has changed? Of course, individuals or employees that we're working with have dealt with a lot of unintended consequences associated with the pandemic, but now we're trying to figure out how some of that might have impacted the financial reporting environment and the controls. Additionally, because of the remote workforce, the digital working environment that we have, there's a higher level of trust that's been placed on the control holders, the individuals charged with actually performing various tasks, performing various levels of review and reconciliation. And because that trust is higher, the burden of proof is now higher. The burden of proof for governmental entities, for financial auditors like you and me, who have to actually understand that the controls are still operating when we're reviewing what might have previously been a physical paper environment that's become fully digital. So that's kind of the genesis of what we're trying to start the conversation about. And of course, I open up to anyone who has war stories or examples or consequences that you've experienced that are byproducts of this that maybe not everyone is thinking of. That would be a great addition to the chat and exactly what we're looking for in this sort of platform. I wanted to kind of kick it off thinking about questions that an entity, a governmental entity or a quasi-public entity could ask itself in the current state that you're in right now, maybe as you're going through a financial audit or as you're reevaluating your internal controls a year later from when the pandemic first started. Have duties been reassigned, right? Have you actually restructured the organization anyway, or is everybody still in the same roles? If so, what's been added? What's been removed? Have things been condensed due to perhaps downsizing or restructuring? And if you have performed any sort of changes in who's performing which functions, who's holding which controls, how has the segregation of duties changed? Have you created situations where the segregation no longer exists? Have you created situations where you need to review IT controls again to make sure that there are systems in place to actually add and remove and re-grant access for individuals that are now in a cloud system versus perhaps a physical system on site? So again, thinking about the main users that are going to want to know about the changes that have occurred, financial auditors, grant auditors, but of course, boards and internal management could really benefit from understanding these sort of things. What are your thoughts on some of this, Lester?
Yeah, and so one of the first considerations you have to think about as all these changes have happened is, have your fraud risk factors increased? You know, what Anthony said, with the changes in delegation of roles and segregation of duties, have the condensing of this and then the changes in processes, have they increased your fraud risk factors? And ideally what you want is you want your controls to help mitigate those factors to detection and prevention controls. So I think we're going to go over a couple of those. Anthony, do you have some that we could think about that have been implemented in the COVID environment?
No, absolutely. Yeah, and you're right. Controls have to be detective or preventative in nature to be a control, right? That's what makes them special in the financial reporting environment. That's what makes them work. If they don't have those components, that nature, then really they're just extra processes and not true controls. So some of the more common things that organizations have gone to, things that I'm sure a lot of people on this call have gone to, are digital sign-offs, right? Some form of digital sign-offs to make sure that if you're routing things electronically, there's evidence and a paper trail, so to speak, of who's actually performing what levels of authorization, review, and approval. But just like perhaps say a digital signature stamp, a physical signature stamp once upon a time was seen as one of the no-nos of internal control, financial reporting control, right? You had to protect it very heavily, because if a physical signature stamp was acquired by the wrong person, or a person who had the ability to control multiple facets of the approval environment, then they could in theory pay themselves, right? Well, the situation holds true if your digital signature environment is not protected as well. Perhaps you use inserted physical stamps rather than an ERP system that routes and electronically signs off. Perhaps you don't have strong controls over access to the system for users, and therefore anybody can sign on. Hopefully not, right? But that situation exists, especially in smaller governmental entities with QuickBooks environments or smaller ERP systems, where the tone at the top has not really been reflective of what it should be to respect the logical access and respect the IT-oriented controls. So absolutely, fraud risk and error risk, the two main ones you're trying to mitigate through these preventative and detective control measures. Employee timekeeping is another example we're seeing a lot of changes around. Timesheets, right? How are individuals proving their level of effort in the field or in working for your entity if you're not there to observe them? Perhaps once upon a time, the primary control, right, the review control in your environment was the supervisor observing the work being performed. With that removed, you now have a new control that allows you to say, yes, we can prove and support to auditors, to grant auditors, et cetera, that the level of effort performed for these individuals actually did exist. And those are the kind of challenges that some entities are up against if they don't have a new control in place. Any others that come to mind for you, Lester?
Yeah, I was just thinking back earlier, you had mentioned, the use of PDFs and things like that. I know we've seen some creative implementations of the stamp tool where folks have gone in and created an inventive little PDF stamp you can impose over an Adobe document that signs it digitally and move it forward. I know some folks have sophisticated ERP systems where, those documents that you need to be reviewed, the invoice and various things like that kind of flow through the system. But for some folks, with QuickBooks and very limited systems, they're just creating a PDF stamp that gets digitally signed and they can forward that on for their review and approval process. Very creative, and there's steps out there. I know at Adobe, their website has some processes you can use to create that stamp. But overall, we feel that's a good control, an extra layer of control to review that stamp for the review and approval process. So any other good ideas that you might have come across, Anthony?
Some things outside of just controls, right? I made reference to kind of tone at the top and some of the intrinsic things that an organization can do to make sure that individuals are on board with the new control environment, right? On board with the digital environment. And it really does start at the top, right? If individuals are seeing boards and senior management not respecting the controls or not abiding by the control environment the way that it should be performed, and they might think that's the way that everything should be performed, right? They might think that it's okay to perhaps be a little more lax in the way that they document time or the way they document review and approval. But setting the expectations up front and in policy, in potential policy changes, would be key to making sure that the message is clear, right? But the logical access side, kind of going back into that a little bit too, it's probably the most critical component now to a digital working environment, right? Making sure that systems are truly set up with passwords, right? Making sure that the devices that individuals are using to access your systems are secured in some way or are protected in some way, even if they're personal devices, right? All of a sudden, when everybody's world was flipped upside down, some organizations basically had to go to allowing private computers, personal computers, to work from home because they didn't have the device infrastructure in place. A lot of that's changed now. A lot of devices kind of have been rolled out to individuals that are keeping that environment. But what if you didn't? What sort of control risks have now been created because of that? Sure, there's virus risk and the things everyone knows about, but what about situations like cloud-based accounting risk, right? We kind of talked about it earlier. If you do not have a system in place to control additions and removals of users in your current environment, and those individuals' roles have changed or those individuals' roles need to change, how do you govern that? How do you make sure it gets updated properly? That's probably the hardest part for organizations that perhaps don't have a dedicated or sophisticated IT environment or system to track everything through.
I think we've noticed early on in the implementation that the user access rights became a very important critical function. You know, as everybody went home for the pandemic, maybe some of those user access rights got switched on completely to give folks access to what they needed early on. But over time, we do feel that you need to tailor those access rights to be appropriate for that individual. And as folks come back to work, you know, working back in the office, we need to make sure that those user access rights are once again restricted to the appropriate level of activity that that person should need for their job function. A very important aspect, you know, we know that some folks have sophisticated and robust IT departments, but when the smaller entities don't have a means to monitor that, it's important to make sure that those user access rights are clearly defined and monitored.
And it can be tracked with something as simple as a form, right? Just a list of individuals, what their roles are, put it in their personnel file, something that supports what access they should have. That way, if that individual leaves or changes positions, that can be reviewed and updated as needed. And of course, get IT involved to the extent that you can. Security, right? Everybody's concerned about security now that perhaps your accounting team was working in one physical environment before, and now they're working in multiple environments, i.e. their houses or coffee shops, or if anybody's working from the beach. I don't know if anyone here is that lucky. But if you have that situation, make sure that you're investing in some security training, right? Our firm, not affiliated with it, but we use a software KnowBe4. They're basically videos that just teach individuals that may not know about every little nuance and particular security risk that might be out there, from things ranging from just general traveling in the airport to phishing attempts and things that are important to remain plugged into, even if you are aware or believe you're aware of all the latest and greatest risks out there from a security perspective. And I think one main thing that's always worth talking about when it comes to major control decisions and major control changes is there is a cost benefit analysis to be had here, right? Not every entity has a 100-person accounting staff. But if you feel like you have the resources internally to segregate properly in a digital environment, definitely reevaluate and make sure that you do so. Definitely make sure that you're not creating situations for individuals to circumvent controls where previously perhaps they couldn't. But at the same time, don't overinvest in the accounting if it makes sense to go a different route and add some higher level review controls, right? A board level review or a managerial level review if you have to make it work with the team that you currently have. We all know resources are strapped these days. So those are some of the main talking points I had. I don't know if any questions had come in, Lester, if you had anything that's kind of come up just yet. So, well,
we did have none's come up yet, but we did have a question last time. And, it was basically, what's one good thing you can do to make sure your control environment is effective once you leave this meeting here? And I would say one of the best things you can do once you hang up is communicate with your staff. Ask everyone involved, is the process working as intended? Obviously, you've got a control document, policies and procedures in place. Hopefully you've updated those as the pandemic has gone on, you know, to describe what's actually happening at your current environment. and keeping it up to date. But ask everyone, is the process we have outlined or the procedures in place, is it appropriate? Are things flowing through that process as it needs to be, or are there problems and differences that you're not aware of? Sometimes maybe some folks are skipping a step, and it's not evident that that's being glossed over. So just talk to everyone. You might not be aware there's a problem out there, but it's important to be aware of it, address it, address your policy to take advantage of that. And maybe it's a situation where you need to create an additional layer of control, maybe another preventative control on the back end or a detective control. So, one of the easiest things you can do once you hang up is just talk to your staff, communicate, and find out, are there any problems that you're not aware of?
I like that. I think that's great. So much of this is intrinsic. So much of this is just getting reconnecting, right, with the individuals that we're working with, just to make sure that everything is happening and people aren't just checking the box, right? And I'm a huge advocate for internal controls, right? The type of work that we do here from the financial audit perspective. But my biggest takeaway to a similar question, I guess, would kind of be make sure that when you're revisiting your controls, that they are really controls. And we hinted at it at the top of this discussion. But if you don't know if they're controls, look for the key terms, right? Look for the key processes. You might know that what you've implemented or what you have individuals doing is protecting it in some way, but look for those key words, whether there's an authorization level that's happening in the control, an approval level, a review level, and a reconciliation level, right? Those items, if you can whittle your processes into where that happens, you might find that you're doing more things than you even need to when in condense the key control processes could be condensed to make your workflow even more efficient.
So another question that just came up is, are there any best practices around securing digital signatures, and is there any unique criteria or things in Adobe Stamps that can be created for individuals to use? And I think, yes, I know there's a lot of different softwares and out there. Obviously, with Adobe, you can create a digital signature that's secured on your local device, and then once it's transmitted forward, it has your signature with the date. I know there are some other softwares, Anthony. I think we used one just the other day. I can't remember the name. Do you remember?
HelloSign, one of our clients a couple clients use that one, but dovetailing on what you're saying there, yeah, there's usually two different types, right? There's the signature that lives in the form of a file that might be password protected and kind of shared in a directory, but only the individual with the password can use it. And then there's the signature platforms that are based on something else, like an email, right? You have to have some sort of two-factor connection to use it. And HelloSign was the one that we just recently used there. I liked it. And I think it's actually very reasonably priced too, at the price of free. But I think the main thing to consider there when it comes to best practices is whichever platform you choose, make sure it's protected. If you choose Adobe signatures that are document signatures, right, where you save them in a location, put passwords on them, right? The individuals with those signatures should want to protect that signature just like they would protect a signature on a check, right? Just like they would protect their own checkbook and the signature stamp, right? I'm probably a slightly bigger fan of the ones that have two-factor ability, right? Because most individuals aren't willing to share access to their email addresses these days. So if you have a signature platform that's tied to a business email incorporated into your IT environment, that's probably where the tech is going. But it doesn't mean that using a document-based signature, an Adobe signature that saves into a file is wrong. Just make sure to protect it with a password. Great question.
Excellent question. I guess one other thing that often comes up in this control discussion is some entity has a small amount of people, a limited number of people that can participate in the process, right? And the typical response here is, well, we still require, you still want to require segregation of duties to follow the authorization, review, and approval process. So what are some things folks can do with smaller staff? How can you get others involved? And one of the most important factors that we often say is, well, the board members, that they are part of the organization, they're charged with governance. It's often important to get them involved. If you don't have enough folks in the process, if you have a limited number of people in your accounting staff, for the review and approval process to flow through. The board. The board is an important element that needs to be involved in the process if you have that. Any other things that folks can do with a limited number of staff in place, Anthony?
That's a great question. And you're right. It's normally more relevant to smaller organizations that do have a governing board, right? To echo some of what you're saying and to kind of continue with the thought of the board just real quick, the main thing that I would encourage any board member that's on this call or any managerial member that could get with their board to express their importance in the process, just as Lester mentioned. But sometimes the review that's happening at the board level is very 20,000 foot view. And you kind of sometimes want it there to ask the big questions, but you've got to figure out exactly where you want it to be, when and where you want it to be at the 5,000 foot view and when you want it to be at the 20,000 foot view. I think that's the important part that would help relieve pressure on a managerial team that isn't a huge accounting managerial team. But board members absolutely in governmental entities hold that role, even though sometimes they may not realize how important that role is. So the more their processes and their adoption of their role could be converted to something that's truly quantitative, that's not just flash review oriented, that's actual detail oriented in some ways without crossing over into becoming management, I think that's huge to alleviate the pressure on a smaller managerial team. The other piece to that is really if you can create I won't call it circular reference, right? But if you have a small team and you've got one person at a governmental entity that's basically charged with running the accounting, your only remedy to that to create a segregation of duties is to add a level at a managerial level that may not be an accountant, right? It might be a chief, it might be someone in operations, someone that has wherewithal to review that individual, but perhaps maybe not a finance person. And that's okay as long as it can be expressed why that's happening and the person has the ability to understand the importance of the control and why they're involved. But in general, the main answer to segregating controls is segregating controls, right? Having different people do different things in a manner that works for your environment. So
an important part of all this, and I know everyone on the call here is probably familiar with the agreed upon procedures. One of the things that auditors often are charged with reviewing is there documentation of the control being performed. So we would encourage everyone, no matter who's involved in the process, just some form of documentation that the review was performed. And oftentimes, I think one of the procedures is often asked for, is there some kind of manual signature or documentation that I think I calls to mind the bank statement was reviewed or the bank reconciliation was reviewed by someone other than the preparer, right? So that's the review function. And oftentimes the important part of that is how can we tell if someone actually performed their procedure? So no matter who's involved in your process, we would encourage you to create some type of documentation so that person can sign. We've talked about digital signing, or just if you have to go old school and pen and paper, we'd encourage some form of process and put that in writing as well. Put in your policy that they're going to document that through some sort of sign and date procedure, just to, it'll help if the procedures ever come back. I know right now we're sort of on a hiatus from performing those, but at some point I'm sure the legislative auditor will reimpose those procedures. So help us out, document that with some sort of digital evidence that the control was performed.
And if you think about it, it's all burden of proof, right? But a lot of entities may have a higher level of burden of proof this year than last year because of the CARES Act money. A lot of entities might trigger single audit requirements this year that previously did not trigger single audit requirements. And even though financial audits and Yellow Book governmental audits still have that, the requirements even become more detailed when you're doing a federal program single audit to prove control over compliance, control over the timing of the review of when something was performed compared to when the money was drawn down. And if an auditor sees something that doesn't jive with that or they can't find that proof, it's a little more black and white there than even sometimes it is in a financial audit where you can still understand what might have happened. So keep that in mind too. You might have single audits this year and program audits from the SBA and FEMA and other organizations that you haven't had to deal with before. And the stronger you can make that documentation, the easier that process is going to be when you have that governmental audit performed. So.
Right, because oftentimes compliance and those are the things that end up in the reports, or we're required to report on internal controls and compliance in the Yellow Book report, as well as you mentioned, any kind of single audit report. So internal controls over compliance are a very important element that we eventually have to report on, and certainly no one wants to have those appear in a schedule of findings and have to answer for those, because those are eventually made available to the public. So just keep in mind this entire control process, reporting and compliance, are all wrapped into itself, and it can eventually cause you a little bit of headache if the findings do result from that. So Anthony, anything else you got one last comment or thought you can think of about this process?
I was going to ask kind of you, if you had any clients as well, kind of thinking outside the box. I've had a few that have converted to digital payment platforms, right? We kind of hinted at this earlier, but didn't go into it. Bill.com, things like that, right? And again, we don't endorse necessarily any of them, but I don't know if organizations are truly using just their ERP systems to get checks out the door, or if they're created some sort of subledger system like a Bill.com or some other payment platform, or if everybody's still working with checks and ACHs these days. But I'm seeing a lot of shift towards that. I think there's a big need for it, and a big there's lots of growth in that sector, just like there is in Zoom, right, and Teams and virtual conferencing. But I think that's one sector to pay attention to kind of going forward. And if anyone comes up with some sort of one size fits all solution for payment processing, maybe not in the governmental space, but something to kind of think about. So.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen a large shift to those payments online processes. And the good thing about those is oftentimes there's a robust electronic paper trail for those. There's a clear line that you can draw as far as how the approval process went. But oftentimes, the source documents, the invoices, those still need some sort of approval support attached to those. But definitely a lot of growth in that area.
Lots of credit card transactions increasing too. Be careful about credit card transactions. Credit card transactions circumvent controls, right? So the act of using one bypasses the authorization phase in general, unless you can prove that it was authorized beforehand. So keep that in mind for anyone listening to that. That credit cards are good if they're useful for your organization, but they have a tendency to bypass the control environment. So.
All right, it looks like we've come to the end of our journey here today, and we would really like to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we had mentioned that there was a prize at the end to be awarded to someone randomly. Anthony, do you have the winner there, or?
I was picking a number from the random listing. Hold on, let me pull this up. I had number 6 on here, but I'm trying to pull up the list to see who that is. Let's see.
I have number 6 is Mr. Michael Coxon. So
that's who I see.
We'll reach out to you with our door prize for the day, and we'd like to thank everyone for joining us. If you have any suggestions for future presentations, we'd really like to hear from you. I think you have our emails, or if you want to contact your support, your director on the job, and let us know. But we thank you again for joining us today, and have a great and wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Y'all take care.